Dr. Alex Raven stood in his dimly lit office, staring at his phone with the latest message from his mentor, Dr. Houston. The older doctor, a constant presence in the hospital, always seemed to be in the know about everything. But this message was different. It contained new instructions, ones that contradicted everything Alex had taught himself and others. In just a few minutes, Alex would face the most critical challenge of his career. In this hospital in Syracuse, New York, he would be forced to make a decision that could shape his future. Saving the patient's life wouldn't be easy, not when he would face fierce opposition from his senior colleague, Dr. Houston, who still held the power and watched every move Alex made. But Alex was certain his methods were the right ones. After years of fighting for his reputation and the validity of his choices, he now had to prove to himself and everyone around him that sometimes going against the grain was necessary. "Get the defibrillator ready," Houston instructed, his voice brisk. "We'll start with the standard procedure. You monitor the vitals, Alex." Alex nodded, but he knew that he wasn't going to simply follow orders without question. He had come to believe that there was more to saving lives than following a rigid set of guidelines. He wasn't going to let the patient slip away because of outdated practices. His fingers twitched as he prepared to suggest a new approach, one that Houston would no doubt dismiss, but he couldn't back down now. His belief in the method was too strong. The minutes dragged on as Alex hovered over the patient, watching the monitors flicker and beep. His hands itched to intervene, to make the change that he knew was necessary. But he also knew that challenging Houston's authority would come at a cost. The older doctor was not a man who took kindly to being second-guessed, especially not in a high-pressure situation like this. Houston continued to issue orders, his movements precise and controlled. But as Alex looked down at the frail patient, his mind raced. There was a way to save him, a better way, but it required a leap of faith. He would have to take that leap, whether Houston approved or not. In the tense silence of the operating room, the sound of the patient's faint heartbeat was a reminder of just how fragile life was. And as the clock ticked on, Alex knew that time was running out. But the question that lingered in the back of his mind was not whether he could save the patient. It was whether he could prove to Houston and to himself that his methods were not only viable, but necessary. As the operation progressed, the atmosphere in the operating room thickened with tension. Alex could feel it with every breath he took, the weight of the decision hanging heavily in the air. He stood over the patient, his hands steady despite the growing pressure. His mind raced with thoughts of the new method he was eager to implement, a method that he believed would save the patient's life in ways the standard procedure never could. But every time his eyes met Dr. Houston's, he felt the cold disapproval radiating from the older man. Houston had been in the field for decades, a veteran in his own right, and he had no patience for innovation that strayed too far from the well-established ways of doing things. The patient's heart continued to race, its rhythm erratic, the beeping of the heart monitor echoing through the sterile room. Alex kept his focus, his hands hovering over the array of instruments, the tension in his shoulders mounting as the minutes passed. Dr. Houston, standing just a few feet away, was a constant presence, his gaze sharp and unwavering. His actions were precise, mechanical even, as he gave orders to the nurses, moving with the authority of someone who had seen it all. But to Alex, it felt more like routine than a true life-saving effort. Houston was a man of tradition, a man who believed in sticking to what had always worked. Alex, on the other hand, was a man driven by a desire to push the boundaries, to prove that there was a way that could offer more than just survival. It could offer a future free from the trauma that so often followed traditional methods. He had been studying the new procedure for months, testing it in simulations, refining it until it was as foolproof as he could make it. He had confidence in it, but that confidence seemed to stand in stark contrast to the rigid certainty that Houston projected. With every passing minute, Alex's internal conflict deepened. He understood why Houston was hesitant. The older doctor had built his entire career on the foundation of tried-and-true practices, methods that had stood the test of time. He had seen enough to know the risks involved in deviating from the norm, but Alex couldn't shake the feeling that this was his moment to make a difference. The patient needed them to act fast, to think outside of the box. If they didn't, they would lose him, and Alex refused to let that happen. The room was growing warmer, the air thick with the pressure of the moment. Alex's hands began to sweat inside his gloves as he glanced once more at the heart monitor. The patient's vitals were beginning to drop. The man on the operating table, once strong and full of life, was now nothing more than a fragile, vulnerable body, a soul in danger of slipping away. Every second counted, but the weight of the decision that loomed over Alex felt almost unbearable. He knew that if he spoke up now, he would be challenging Houston in front of the entire team, a move that could either win him respect or ruin his career. The year was 2025, Syracuse, New York. The early morning light filtered through the blinds, casting a soft glow in the sterile hospital room. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound as Alex Raven, a 28-year-old young and ambitious doctor, stirred in his bed. He had always prided himself on his ability to work through exhaustion, but today his body felt heavier than usual. His sleep had been restless, filled with flashes of long hours in the ER and the faces of patients he'd seen recently. It wasn't the usual peaceful rest that he needed, but he knew that today would be no different from the others. He would be pushed to the limit once again. But as he looked at the patient's face, pale and sweating, Alex realized that he wasn't just fighting for his career. He turned to Houston, his voice calm but firm, the weight of his words carrying a sense of quiet defiance. He knew what he had to do. The decision had already been made in his mind. He couldn't wait any longer. As if on cue, the patient's heart rate began to falter further. The beep of the monitor grew more erratic, faster, more frantic. The team around them began to move with greater urgency, nurses and assistants rushing to carry out Houston's orders. But Alex's mind was elsewhere, his thoughts focused on the new approach he wanted to implement. He could see it in his mind's eye, how it would work, how it could save this man's life. Houston, sensing the shift, moved closer, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "What do you think you're doing, Alex?" His voice was low but heavy with authority. It was a reprimand, not a question. "We need to stabilize him with the standard procedure now. You're going to risk his life over some new method?" Alex didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He had come too far to back down now. "Without risk, there's no progress," he said, his voice steady despite the turbulence inside him. For a brief moment, there was silence. The room seemed to freeze, the tension palpable in the space between them. Houston's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. Alex could see the storm brewing in the older man's eyes, the conflict between professional pride and the undeniable truth that the patient needed help, needed it now. "Fine," Houston snapped, stepping back. "Do it your way. But if this goes wrong, it's on you." Alex nodded once, turning his attention back to the patient. He didn't waste any more time. He moved swiftly, his hands steady as he adjusted the equipment, bypassing some of the standard procedures in favor of his own. The team, though nervous, followed his lead. There was no turning back now. In those tense moments, time seemed to stretch. Every move Alex made felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 lives. The rhythm of his actions was almost mechanical, each one carried out with precision. But there was an underlying sense of urgency that kept him moving faster, thinking faster. He could feel the pressure building in his chest, his pulse racing in time with the beeping of the monitor. Houston watched, his arms crossed, but there was no doubt that his eyes were following every movement Alex made. The older doctor's face was set in stone, but there was something in his gaze now. Something that wasn't quite disdain, but perhaps an uneasy respect. For the first time in a long time, Houston wasn't in control. Alex had taken the reins and all he could do now was watch. Suddenly, the sharp vibration of his phone jolted him awake. Groggily, he reached out to silence it, his eyes struggling to adjust to the bright light of the morning. He saw the name of Dr. Houston flashing across the screen, his mentor, the head of the hospital, and a man whose reputation in the medical community was both revered and feared. The message was short, urgent, and to the point. "Alex, I need you in OR 3. We've got an emergency, now." The patient's vitals continued to fluctuate, and for a moment, it seemed as though they might lose him. But then, just as quickly, the numbers began to stabilize. The heart monitor's beeping slowed to a more regular pace, and the chaos in the room began to subside. The tension that had gripped everyone in the operating room started to ease. But for Alex, it wasn't over yet. They were not out of danger. He stepped back, watching as the team worked quickly to complete the final stages of the operation. His heart was still pounding in his chest, his mind still spinning from the risk he had taken. But the patient was alive, and that was all that mattered. The quiet hum of the machines filled the space around him, a reminder that the battle wasn't over. But for now, they had won. The tension in the operating room had reached a breaking point. The patient, once a fragile but stable figure, began to deteriorate. His breathing became shallow and his pulse weakened, a clear sign that the situation was slipping out of control. The steady hum of the machines that had been a constant presence now felt like an oppressive force, each beep and click marking a moment of precious time lost. The patient's once faint heartbeat had now become erratic, the monitor spiking dangerously before falling flat again. The atmosphere in the room shifted abruptly, from calculated precision to frantic urgency. Alex stood at the head of the table, his gaze fixed on the patient. His fingers twitched, an instinctual reaction to the crisis unfolding before him. He had been waiting for this moment, preparing for it in his mind. But now that it was here, he felt the full weight of the decision ahead. He had always known that there would be risk when implementing his new approach, but seeing the patient's vitals collapse so suddenly made everything more real. Every second now felt like an eternity, and in that moment, Alex knew that they had to act fast, or the patient would slip away. Dr. Houston, standing at the opposite side of the table, seemed unshaken by the urgency of the moment. His expression was one of controlled calculation, his hands moving with deliberate speed to execute the conventional steps that had served him throughout his decades of practice. But Alex, despite the pressure, could feel the gnawing certainty that he needed to take a different path. He had no time for hesitation. His eyes flicked to the patient's rapidly deteriorating condition, and without thinking further, he made his choice. The decision to act felt like it took an eternity to make, but in reality it was almost instantaneous. He was no longer simply a doctor following the rules. He was someone making a calculated risk, determined to fight for the life of this man. Alex's mind, clear despite the chaos, quickly ran through the new procedure in his head. It was untested in an emergency situation like this, but he was convinced it was their only shot. Turning to the medical staff, Alex made the call. His voice was steady, but the urgency was unmistakable. He instructed the team to abandon the conventional approach and instead adopt the method he had been practicing. He could feel Houston's eyes on him, the older doctor's disapproval palpable. Houston, never one to back down easily, immediately voiced his objections, his sharp tone cutting through the tension in the room. But Alex, with his hands still hovering over the patient, ignored the objections. He had to follow his instincts. The room seemed to hold its breath as Alex took control. His mind raced, moving faster than the rapid beeping of the monitor as he worked with the precision of a man who had studied every nuance of the method he was about to employ. He didn't waste time second-guessing himself. There was no room for doubt in moments like this. As the room continued to hum with tension, Alex moved quickly, connecting wires and adjusting the equipment, performing the untested procedure with confidence. The team, though uncertain, followed his lead. Minutes passed like hours as Alex focused entirely on the task at hand. His hands never shook, but his mind was a storm of thoughts and calculations. Every movement had to be perfect, every adjustment precise. His heart raced as he watched the patient's vitals, praying for any sign of improvement. For a moment, it seemed as if the patient's condition would continue to decline. The faint rhythm of the heart monitor seemed to mock him, slowing and speeding unpredictably. Alex's chest tightened. He couldn't afford to let up, not now. Then, as if the world had suddenly slowed, the numbers on the monitor stabilized. Alex blinked, unable to believe his eyes. The rapid fluctuations began to smooth out, and the rhythm of the heart became more consistent. The beat, once erratic and harsh, steadied into a regular pulse. A sense of cautious relief washed over him, but Alex kept his focus. He had seen too many times how fragile these moments could be. A wave of both excitement and dread washed over him as he sat up. He wasn't surprised. Dr. Houston's messages always carried the same tone. No room for questions, no time for hesitation. The message also brought a sense of foreboding. Emergency surgeries were never routine, and with Dr. Houston, they were often even more intense. But Alex couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different. Today would push him further than he had ever been before. It always did when Houston was involved. The room, once filled with frantic energy, now grew quiet. The only sound was the steady beeping of the monitor, marking the patient's slow but sure recovery. Alex let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His muscles ached, but the tension in his body eased as the patient's condition continued to improve. The moment of crisis had passed, but it had come at a cost. His decision to act against Houston's instructions was a gamble that had paid off, but it was still a gamble. Dr. Houston, who had stood silently throughout the procedure, watched with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant acknowledgement. His eyes, usually so firm and resolute, now held a flicker of surprise. He had seen many doctors come and go, many new ideas that fizzled out under pressure. But this time, something was different. He had to admit that Alex's decision, though risky, had worked. The patient was alive, and that was all that mattered. For a moment, the two doctors locked eyes, the unspoken words hanging in the air between them. As the team began to wrap up the procedure, Alex stepped back, his hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline that had kept him steady began to wear off. His mind raced, processing what had just happened. He had made a choice, one that he knew would change everything. He had taken a risk, and the results spoke for themselves. But as Alex looked down at the patient, still unconscious but stable, he knew that the road ahead would not be easy. This victory, as sweet as it was, came with consequences. He had defied authority, broken away from the traditional methods that had guided the hospital for so long. And while the patient's survival was the ultimate reward, Alex couldn't help but wonder what the fallout would be. For now, though, the patient was alive, and Alex had proven, at least for this moment, that sometimes the most dangerous risks led to the most extraordinary rewards. But the true test, he knew, was just beginning. The hours following the operation were filled with a heavy silence. The once chaotic atmosphere of the operating room had been replaced by the quiet hum of medical machines in the recovery unit. The patient, whose life had hung in the balance just hours before, now lay in a sterile hospital bed, breathing steadily. His vitals, once erratic and dangerous, had calmed into a stable rhythm. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was now a reassuring sound, marking the return of stability. The medical team had moved the patient to a post-operative care unit, their work for the time being complete. Yet for Alex and Dr. Houston, the ordeal was far from over. Alex stood by the patient's bedside, his arms crossed over his chest, his thoughts swirling with the weight of the decision he had made. He couldn't deny the relief he felt at the patient's survival, but the truth lingered in the back of his mind. The method he had employed was still unproven in such high-stakes circumstances, and the risk he had taken was not something to be taken lightly. It was a gamble that had paid off for now, but the cost of the risk had yet to be fully understood. Dr. Houston, his face still hard with skepticism, had been following the patient's recovery from a distance. He had kept his distance during the operation, allowing Alex to lead, but now he stood nearby, observing with a quiet intensity. The older doctor's gaze flickered between the patient and Alex, and there was no mistaking the tension in the air. The unease between them had not dissipated. In fact, it felt even more palpable now that the immediate crisis had passed. Houston was a man of experience, his methods tried and tested over the years. Alex, though undeniably skilled, had just crossed a line. The methods he had used were not just unconventional, they were controversial. As the patient's condition stabilized further and the team began to leave the room, Houston finally spoke. His voice was calm but tinged with an undercurrent of frustration. "You did what you thought was necessary, Alex," he said, his words deliberate. "But do you understand what this looks like? We risked the life of the patient for your experiment. What if it had gone wrong? What if he hadn't made it?" Alex's eyes remained fixed on the patient for a moment before he responded, his voice steady, though there was a hint of resolve in it. "I understand the risk, Dr. Houston, but I believe our job as doctors is not to follow patterns blindly. It's to innovate, to push the boundaries when the old ways are no longer enough. We owe it to our patients to do everything we can to save them, even if that means stepping outside of the conventional methods." Within minutes, Alex was out of bed, pulling on his scrubs and grabbing his jacket as he rushed through the corridors of the hospital. His heart raced, not just from the physical effort of getting to the operating room, but from the anticipation of the unknown. His thoughts were a blur, but there was one thing that was clear. Today, he would have to prove himself again. He couldn't afford to show any doubt in front of Houston or anyone else, not today. Houston was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable as he processed Alex's words. The air between them felt heavy, filled with the weight of the disagreement that had been simmering beneath the surface. It was clear that Houston, despite his outward calm, was still struggling with the new approach that Alex had adopted. The older doctor had spent decades refining his methods, and Alex's unconventional methods felt like a challenge, a direct contradiction to everything he believed in. As the conversation continued, it became clear that this was not just about one procedure or one patient. The conflict between Alex and Houston was rooted in something deeper, a clash of philosophies of what it meant to be a doctor. Houston had spent years building his reputation on the idea that medicine was an exact science, one that required precision, consistency, and adherence to established protocols. But Alex's belief was different. He saw medicine as an evolving field, one that demanded constant questioning and adaptation. For him, there was no room for complacency. There was always more to learn, new methods to explore, new ways to save lives. Houston's doubt was apparent as he continued to grapple with Alex's unorthodox approach. It wasn't that he didn't recognize the potential for progress in Alex's methods. It was that he didn't fully understand the urgency that Alex felt. He had spent so many years perfecting his own style that it was difficult for him to see a place for anything new, especially when it meant taking risks that might backfire. For Alex, however, the doubts were less about the methods themselves and more about the larger picture. He understood that he had made a bold choice, but he was convinced that it was the right one. He had seen too many patients suffer from outdated treatments, too many lives lost because the medical field had been reluctant to change. Alex knew that his journey was just beginning. This was not just one successful operation, it was the start of a new way of thinking, a new way of practicing medicine. But the road ahead would not be easy. He would have to continue to fight for what he believed in, even if it meant going against the grain, even if it meant facing the doubts of colleagues like Houston. In the days that followed, as the patient's recovery continued, Alex found himself reflecting on the events that had transpired. He thought about the risks, the tension in the operating room, and the quiet aftermath. It wasn't just the patient's survival that weighed on his mind. It was the larger implications of his actions. Would Houston ever truly come to accept his methods? Would the hospital's leadership support him in the long term, or would he find himself facing resistance at every turn? Despite the uncertainty, Alex felt a sense of resolve growing within him. He knew that what he had done was not without consequence, but it was also a necessary step forward. Medicine was evolving, and he had chosen to be a part of that evolution. He was ready to face whatever challenges came his way, knowing that every step forward was a step toward something better. As for Dr. Houston, though he still held on to his convictions, there was a subtle shift in his perspective. He couldn't deny the results. The patient had survived, and for now, that was all that mattered. But it was clear that the gap between his traditional methods and Alex's innovative approach had not been bridged yet. The question now was whether the two could find a way to work together, combining the wisdom of experience with the promise of progress. The patient, now slowly recovering and showing signs of improvement, was a living testament to Alex's decision. But for both him and Houston, the real challenge would come in the weeks and months ahead. The questions that had been raised in the operating room about risk, innovation, and the future of medicine would continue to echo in their minds, shaping the path they would take from this point forward. The journey of recovery, both for the patient and for Alex, was just beginning. The next morning, the weight of the previous day's events still hung heavy on Alex's shoulders. He walked into the hospital, his mind preoccupied with the patient's recovery and the fallout from his risky decision. He had known that there would be consequences. He had prepared himself for it, but he couldn't deny the unease that settled in his chest when he saw the message waiting for him. It was from the hospital administration. The note was terse and to the point. A review of your recent procedure is scheduled. Please prepare for an internal audit. The implications were clear. The hospital was not pleased with his unapproved approach, and now the very methods that had saved the patient's life were under scrutiny. Alex felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. The message was no surprise. He had known that breaking with tradition would bring about consequences. But the fear was still there. Fear of losing his job, his reputation, and possibly his future in medicine. The path he had chosen was fraught with risks, not just for the patient but for his own career as well. The thought of facing a formal investigation into his methods made him second-guess himself for a fleeting moment. But only for a moment. Deep down, he knew that he couldn't back down now. He had made a decision, and despite the potential fallout, he had to stand by it. He arrived at the door to OR3, taking a deep breath before entering. Inside, the sterile, cold environment of the operating room greeted him. The bright lights above flickered slightly, casting sharp shadows across the cold steel instruments neatly arranged on the counters. Dr. Houston was already there, his back turned to Alex as he reviewed the patient's file. The older man was a figure of authority, his demeanor commanding yet distant. His arms were crossed in front of him, and as Alex stepped inside, Houston didn't even glance over his shoulder. As the morning passed, Alex's anxiety grew. He found himself pacing in the small office they had given him for the day, running through every possible scenario in his mind. He had already seen the consequences of not taking risks. He had seen patients lost to outdated methods in a system that resisted change. He had fought for the opportunity to be a part of something bigger, to push the boundaries of medicine, but now he was faced with the harsh reality of what that might cost him. It was in this moment of uncertainty that Dr. Houston walked into the office. The older doctor's presence was always commanding, but today there was something different in his demeanor. Alex looked up, his mind still swirling with thoughts of the upcoming audit, and met Houston's gaze. The tension that had lingered between them for days seemed to have evaporated, replaced by something softer, more introspective. Houston stood for a moment at the door, his usual confidence replaced by a rare vulnerability. He didn't say anything right away, just looked at Alex as though assessing him, weighing the gravity of the situation. Alex, still unsure of what Houston was going to say, waited. Finally, Houston spoke, his voice steady but tinged with an acknowledgement Alex hadn't expected. "You were right, Alex. I was too rigid, too focused on what I thought was safe. I didn't want to open myself to new ideas, didn't want to embrace something that seemed risky. But you've shown me that fear of the new is not something we, as doctors, should be governed by." Alex's heart skipped a beat. He had expected resistance, but hearing Houston acknowledge his approach, his methods, took him by surprise. The older doctor's words were not just an apology, they were a recognition of something deeper. Houston had built his career on tradition, and for him to admit that Alex's untested approach had merit was no small thing. It was a rare admission, one that Alex knew carried a heavy weight. For a moment, Alex felt a rush of relief. He had feared that Houston would never accept his approach, that the older man's rejection of anything unconventional would stand as a barrier between them. But now it seemed that Houston was beginning to see things from his perspective. It wasn't just a victory in the operating room anymore. It was a validation of everything Alex had fought for. His belief in innovation, his commitment to challenging the status quo, it was all starting to feel worth it. Houston continued, his gaze softening slightly. "You've done something that many would have been too afraid to try, and while I still have my doubts about some of the methods you've employed, I can't deny the results. The patient is alive, and that's what matters." There was a pause. Alex stood there processing Houston's words. There was no triumph in his heart, no sense of gloating. Instead, there was a quiet sense of understanding, a realization that what had begun as a professional battle had now become a personal one. Houston, in his own way, was acknowledging that change was necessary, that the field of medicine could not remain stagnant. And in doing so, he had handed Alex something far more valuable than a victory in the operating room. He had given him the validation he needed to continue down his chosen path. The internal audit, the threat to his career, it all still loomed ahead, but for the first time, Alex felt a sense of confidence that wasn't rooted in fear. He had fought for what he believed in, and now he could see that it wasn't just the patient's life he had saved, it was his own professional future. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Alex felt ready to face it head on. The sense of relief that had washed over him was not because of Houston's words alone, but because Alex knew that he had chosen a path that aligned with his deepest convictions. He had fought for innovation in the face of tradition, for progress when others were content to follow the well-worn path. And in that moment, he understood something crucial. His journey had only just begun. The patient, a frail elderly man, lay unconscious on the operating table. His vitals were unstable, and the diagnosis was clear: high risk of a fatal heart attack. The situation was dire. Alex could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him, but it wasn't the first time he had encountered such urgency. What was different today, however, was the tension that simmered in the air. Dr. Houston's eyes narrowed as he flicked through the patient's chart one last time, his voice low and steady as he issued commands to the nursing staff. There was no sign of hesitation from him, no sense of urgency beyond the measured precision he was known for. As Houston left the room, Alex stood in the quiet office, reflecting on the path he had taken. The road ahead would undoubtedly be filled with more challenges, more conflicts, and more difficult decisions. But he was no longer afraid. He had made the right choice, not just for the patient, but for himself. And as he moved forward, he knew that his fight for innovation, for progress, would continue to shape the future of his career. It was a battle worth fighting, and for the first time, Alex truly believed that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Several weeks had passed since the intense scrutiny of Alex's methods, and during that time, a sense of quiet anticipation had settled over the hospital. The internal review had come and gone, and Alex had spent countless hours preparing for the inevitable questions, the probing of his decisions. Despite his initial fears, the results of his surgery had spoken for themselves. The patient had not only survived but was on the road to a full recovery, far beyond what the traditional methods could have promised. This fact could not be ignored, and as the days went by, it became clear that Alex's unorthodox approach had found a place within the hospital's framework. Now it was time for the final step, meeting with the hospital's leadership. Alex walked into the conference room, his nerves slightly rattled, but his posture confident. The room was sterile and brightly lit, a place that always felt more intimidating than comforting. Sitting at the long table were several figures from the hospital administration, each with their own skeptical or hopeful gaze fixed on him. They had all seen the reports, heard the reviews, and now it was time for Alex to face the ultimate judgment. As the meeting progressed, Alex was questioned on every detail of his approach, the methodology, the risks, the potential for widespread adoption. He was calm, answering each question with the precision of someone who had lived and breathed his decisions over the past weeks. There were moments of hesitation, particularly when discussing the broader implications of using his method across the hospital. But Alex stood firm, defending his belief that medicine could not remain stagnant. It had to evolve, it had to grow, and if they wanted to stay ahead, they had to take calculated risks. By the end of the meeting, Alex could feel the weight lifting from his shoulders. The committee had come to a decision. His approach was not only acceptable, it was the future. The leadership granted him full support not just for the continuation of his method, but for the development of new programs designed to integrate innovation into the hospital's practices. The success of the patient and the promising potential for future treatments had sealed his fate. Alex was now a recognized figure, someone who could bring change to an institution steeped in tradition. When he left the meeting, his mind was buzzing with the possibilities ahead. He knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, not just in his career, but in the way the hospital approached medicine. But as he made his way down the hall, he was met by someone whose approval, to him, meant even more than that of the administrators. Dr. Houston was waiting outside, his usual stern expression replaced by something more thoughtful. For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of the past few weeks hanging between them. Houston's position had shifted since the operation, and the results of the review had only solidified his evolving perspective. Despite his initial resistance, despite his long-standing adherence to traditional methods, Houston had come to realize that Alex's approach was not only viable, it was necessary. The hospital needed change, and it needed the young, forward-thinking minds like Alex's to drive it forward. Houston looked at Alex with an expression that was both proud and filled with a sense of unspoken understanding. He had never been one to openly express his emotions, but the shift in his tone was clear. He had not only accepted Alex's methods, but he had begun to admire the courage it had taken to challenge the system. It was a rare thing for someone like Houston, who had built a career on authority and control, to admit that perhaps the future lay in collaboration, in blending the tried and true with the innovative. "You've earned it, Alex," Houston said quietly, his voice filled with an admiration that spoke volumes. "You've proven yourself, and more than that, you've shown me that we're capable of more than what we've been doing. I want you to join me in this. Become my partner in the projects we've been talking about. Together, we can push this hospital into the future." Alex was taken aback by the offer. He had always respected Houston, but had never imagined this moment, this gesture of collaboration. In Houston's eyes, Alex saw the recognition of the risk he had taken, the change he had embraced. But more than that, Alex saw the recognition of his own growth. It wasn't just about the method anymore. It was about who he had become as a doctor, as a leader, as a person who was willing to stand up for what he believed in, even when it meant going against the status quo. Alex stepped forward, adjusting his gloves as he prepared to assist. He could feel Houston's presence like a force, the older man's shadow looming over him, as always. But Alex was not the same young intern who had first walked into this hospital years ago. He had learned, he had grown, and he had a new vision for the future of medicine, one that often clashed with the traditional methods Houston held so tightly to. Alex had been experimenting with innovative techniques, using cutting-edge technology to treat patients in ways that were less invasive and more effective. He had read about these methods in journals, tested them in simulations, and was eager to see them implemented in real-world scenarios. But there was one problem. Houston didn't share his enthusiasm for new approaches. For a moment, Alex thought about the path he had walked, about the tension with Houston, the uncertainty, the risk. He thought about the sacrifices, the doubts, and the eventual triumphs. But as he looked at Houston, he realized that this wasn't just a moment of personal victory. It was a partnership, a new beginning for both of them. They were no longer teacher and student. They were colleagues, peers, ready to build something greater than either could have done alone. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the hospital, Alex looked out of the window, the city stretching out before him. The hospital, with all its sterile walls and demanding hours, had become his home, a place where he had not just learned about medicine, but had reshaped his understanding of what it meant to be a doctor. And now, with Houston by his side, they would begin something new, something that could change the future of healthcare itself. They didn't need grand speeches or sweeping declarations. They simply stood there looking out at the horizon, knowing that the future was filled with possibilities. It was no longer just about surviving as doctors. It was about thriving, about pushing the boundaries and ensuring that every decision, every innovation made a real difference in the lives of those they cared for. In the quiet of the evening, as the last of the day's light faded, Alex and Houston stood side by side, understanding without words that this was only the beginning. The challenges ahead were daunting, but together they would face them. The hospital, once a place of tradition and routine, would become a center for progress and change. And in that moment, Alex knew that whatever lay ahead, he was ready. They both were. As Alex took his position beside the operating table, he could sense the unspoken disagreement between them. The air felt thick with tension, and he could almost hear the silent words of disapproval from the older doctor. Houston's methods were based on years of experience and well-established protocols, while Alex's approach was new, unproven in such a high-stakes situation.